Howdy folks, today we're looking at Marvel's Kull the Conqueror Volume 3, Number 3 from 1983. I've yet to be disappointed with any purchases from Marvel's Conan office in the 80s. Consistently some of the company's best books throughout the period, they often featured top-tier talent working at an expanded page length. Case in point, this giant-sized issue of Kull. No ads, John Buscema at his finest, inked and colored on every glorious page by Klaus Janson. Now, Kull is usually a bit more wordy a strip than Conan. Kull's world is a political one, constrained by responsibilities. The fantasy is tempered in a way that seems familiar to modern audiences, accustomed to adult fantasy with significantly more in the way of politics and interpersonal conflict than scary boogums. There are a few of those, yes, as well as fell pirates and high priests conspiring to destroy the king, but also senators fighting to preserve their economic system. The secondary conflict consists of Kull's attempts to rid his kingdom of slavery, only to lose a unanimous vote among senators who see the entire system would fall apart without the quote-unquote civilized institution propping it up. Buscema and Janson fit together well. It's a stark and brutal vision of an ancient world. Janson imports some jagged Miller-esque expressionism in place of the expected lush detail work, and the results throughout are unquestionably striking. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Two-Fisted Tales number 2 from EC Comics, or rather Russ Cochran's reprint from the early 90s. There never was an issue number 2 of Two-Fisted Tales during the original run in the 50s, rather the title took over the numbering from The Haunt of Fear. The second issue of Cochran's reprint, therefore, actually presents the 19th issue of the book as originally numbered. In any event, with the Korean War fresh in the headlines, the creators soon focused on war stories exclusively, so this early issue stands out as a kind of curio for its inclusion of more general adventure stories to go alongside Kurtzman's anti-war broadsides. Reading EC in something close to its original presentation is a helpful history lesson. The stories here weren't universally great. There's a Johnny Craig number about escaping from war-torn Europe that fails to find anything resembling a hook, and similarly the young Wally Wood's brutal Captain Bull spends its running time building to a confrontation that mostly occurs off-panel when it finally arrives. There's some very dated depictions of South American natives in a Kurtzman yarn that could easily have run in one of the company's horror books. The only real standout here is the John Severin Leeds story, which foreshadows the more thoughtful and rigorously anti-war material that would soon become the title's mainstay. Howdy folks, today we're looking at DC's Green Arrow Annual number 5 from 1992. This is part of that summer's big crossover event, Eclipso the Darkness Within. Now, this era of Green Arrow was rather famous for keeping its nose out of traditional superhero shenanigans. So how does the character react to being press-ganged into a fight with a cosmic supervillain who lives on the moon? Not great. He calls Batman for help to save Black Canary after Dinah is possessed, and ends up complaining the whole time. I don't usually feel a lot of sympathy for Batman, but I definitely felt his frustration at having to deal with Oliver Queen here, self-righteous to the point of being a deeply unserious person in the face of a real threat. Now, why did I pick this annual up? One reason. It's written by Sarah Byam and drawn by the great Trevor Von Eden. This is the creative team behind Dinah's excellent solo outings during this period, a miniseries that preceded this book in 91 and an ongoing that followed right on its heels. Frankly, this isn't quite up to the standard of those two excellent books. Frank Springer shows up to ink Von Eden, and it's an interesting match. Real heavy feathering over Von Eden's meticulous layouts. The standout here, as for much of this period at DC, is Julia Lacquemont on colors. If this doesn't feel like an essential work from any of the primaries, Lacquemont elevates matters significantly with her indelible turquoise. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Fast Willie Jackson number 5 from the summer of 1977. Fitzgerald Publishing didn't last long in the scheme of things, but they left a fairly big impression, largely through the Golden Legacy series of illustrated biographies of important figures from African American history. Fast Willie Jackson didn't last quite as long. This is the 5th of only 7 issues that saw print, and information on the books themselves is scarce. Comics.org credits the publisher Bertram Fitzgerald as probable writer, along with artist Gus Lemoyne. There isn't much about Lemoyne online, save that he worked for Archie from the late 60s through the 70s. Fast Willie here is a dead-on adaptation of the distinctive Dan DeCarlo house style, only put to the service of illustrating a less white-bread vision of teen culture. I didn't pay a lot for these when I picked them up out of a random bin over 20 years ago, but their rarity has made them more valuable in recent years. A shame, because the book was actually funny in a way that Archie often struggles, and I wouldn't mind having a full set. Perhaps it has something to do with the novelty of seeing an actual multiracial cast in an urban environment, acknowledging cultural differences while using light humor to bridge the inevitable gaps, a more realistic vision of American youth culture than the already frozen in amber exploits of the estimable Archie Andrews and company. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Marvel's recent facsimile edition of X-23 #1 from 2004. Now, this is not the first appearance of Laura Kinney, the once and former clone of Wolverine. Technically, that was on the X-Men Evolution TV show in 2003. And even more technically, her first comic book appearance was the ill-fated NYX series from 2004. Now, you might recall NYX as being the catalyst for David Cho's abrupt exit from the comics industry in 2001. So X-23's edition was clearly a later creative decision after that series had already lingered years in limbo. Her inclusion proved a controversial decision as well, one the character's creators did their studious best to paper over when given the chance to write a real origin for her in 2005, which is where this comic enters the picture. Leave it be said, the details of her origin as presented here have undergone even more recent revision, all frankly unnecessary in my opinion, as the character as presented under the stewardship of her creators, Craig Kyle and Christopher Yost, proved wildly successful and in no time whatsoever became the fan favorite she remains to this day. Billy Tan's work here is quite decent, considering it's mostly talking heads and lab equipment, but I can't help but think he, like many artists from this era, could have benefited from an inker with a chunkier brush line. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Astra #1, an Astro City special from 2009. This was one of a number of interstitial specials released in between larger acts of the series' epical Dark Ages arc. I happened upon this lonely issue in a dollar box not that long ago. I've read all the Astro City material in one format or another, but not always in the original pamphlets. I'm really struck by the effort put into making this single issue feel like a complete object unto itself, the kind of charming effort that sadly rarely translates to collection. Lots of comics have tried the fake magazine cover shtick. Few have had the nerve to follow through on the joke by blanketing an Alex Ross cover with obnoxious captions. This story is as good as Astro City usually is, which means about as good as comics get, especially the shorter material. If the longer serials can occasionally flag, one or two issue character pieces like this remain what Kurt Busiek does better than just about anyone else. This is a spotlight on the first family, longtime background fixtures who we see through the eyes of a young woman who wishes she were anything but famous. Brent Anderson remains the steady hand on the till. The series works because the characters look and move like people, showcasing a subtlety of affect not often utilized in superhero stories. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Magnus Robot Fighter #22 from 1968 in Gold Key Comics. This issue reprints the very first appearance of Magnus from 5 years earlier by the character's creator, Russ Manning. Magnus was one of Gold Key's improbable entries into the superhero sweepstakes of the 1960s. Manning is one of the great draftsmen in the history of comics, which gives Magnus's early adventures a classical air, a fully retro, at a time when depictions of the future were already moving on from the kind of rounded silver and chrome fantasies depicted in earlier decades of comics and pulps. Magnus's world is stiff and formal, portraying a purely functional attitude towards character that would have seemed already even consciously fusty, especially in an era increasingly defined by the work of more idiosyncratic creators such as Kirby and Ditko. By 1968, the year this reprint was published, Manning had already moved on from the character to Tarzan, both in comics and on newspaper pages. Manning's gorgeous vision of the future would have been thoroughly out of step in 68, a period when even DC was beginning the process of changing up a house style, thoroughly lapped by puckish rivals. That said, Magnus remains a strangely compelling figure. The themes which animated his adventures still remain distressingly relevant. Here he fights an automated police bureaucracy determined to impose tyrannical rule on an indolent population. Purely the stuff of fantasy in 2023, surely. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at the 200th issue of The Brave and the Bold from 1983. Not merely a giant-sized anniversary issue for one of DC's most storied anthologies, dating back all the way to the birth of the Silver Age in 1955, but also, sadly, its last issue, barring the occasional revival. It would be difficult to argue they didn't pull out all the stops, however, given that the main feature for this issue was a double-sized Batman adventure drawn by none other than Mr. Dave Gibbons. Yes, 40 pages of Batman drawn by Gibbons in his prime and written by Mike W. Barr, one of the era's most prolific Bat writers. The story features not one Batman, but two Batmen, the Batman of Earths 1 and 2. Now, they don't actually meet in the story. That the Earth 2 Batman lived and died much earlier than his Earth 1 counterpart is crucial to the plot. The villain here is a one-off. Brimstone, a satanic-themed villain who, according to the flashback here, menaced the Batman and Robin of Earth 2 during their heyday in the late 1950s. The extended flashback gives Gibbons the opportunity to pay homage to the talent behind that seminal era, the likes of Dick Sprang and Sheldon Moldoff. And then a few pages later, Gibbons also gets to draw the character's then-current Bronze Age incarnation. In practice, this means more detail work, more attention paid to things like the way a cape hangs naturally, more dynamic page layouts. In practice, the issue serves as a visual symposium on Batman before and after the advent of Neil Adams. The story itself is serviceable. I can't help but think that Barr missed a bet by not having the Earth 1 Batman figure out the villain's gimmick. Not like he didn't know all about Earth 2. Frankly, the idea of a villain so upset at missing his chance to kill one Batman that he reaches across dimensions to kill another is stronger than the story itself credits. Now, because this is a really big comic, the last third is occupied by a special preview of the new book slated to take the place of this one on the publishing slate. Batman and the Outsiders, also written by Barr and drawn by the incomparable Jim Aparo, my personal pick for favorite Bat artist. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Ghost Rider number 6 from 2007, part of Daniel Way's generally well-regarded run on the character. This issue's the first half of a very special two-parter illustrated by one of the greatest artists of his or any other era, Richard Corbin. Corbin actually did a fair amount of work for Marvel after the turn of the century, not just those beautiful half-forgotten anthology series of Poe and Lovecraft stories, but memorable turns on the likes of the Hulk, Luke Cage, and the Punisher. And he also set in for Ghosty here. Although the story is part of Way's larger arc, which I don't remember all that well at this remove, it is by no means bogged down in unwelcome continuity. On the contrary, the premise of the run was pretty basic. Johnny Blaze traveling around to different parts of the country, tracking pieces of Lucifer's soul, which provided old Flamehead with a steady stream of satanic monsters to fight. The action split between a brawl with a demon in the modern day, a nasty piece of work possessing a Southern Baptist minister, and a flashback with Johnny Blaze set up for a murder rap by crooked cops in Lynchburg, Tennessee. Way knows the score, provide a diverse array of nasty customers for Corbin to render in the most grotesque manner possible. Demon, cop, or unctuous lawyer, it comes out to roughly the same under Corbin's pen. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at The Forged number 1, a brand new sci-fi epic from Greg Rucka, Eric Troutman, and Mike Henderson. All three are co-credited for the story, and it's a big one. A thick magazine stuffed with all kinds of lore and back matter, including dog pictures. I hadn't really heard of this project, but seeing the physical package prompted an immediate purchase. A thick magazine-sized comic with a double-sized story, all for only $5.99. Frankly, an irresistible price point for such an attractive object. They can't be making money on this. But what do I know? I wish every day Marvel would resurrect their black and white magazine line. In lieu of that, special releases like this are the closest we get in 2023 to that kind of bountiful. As for the story, so far so good. The first issue is pretty packed, but mostly with exposition, character work, place setting. There's nothing really that new here in the shape of the setup if you're familiar with the likes of Warhammer or Dune or Aliens. There are bits and pieces of all that, what with the premise of space marines on a mysterious mission at the behest of an absentee space monarch. What does stand out is the general air of sensuality often missing from contemporary space opera, a hangover perhaps of Lucas's largely sexless vision of a galaxy far, far away. This is a very contemporary book, stuffed by muscular women with rippling abs, talking frankly about sex, the cure for what ails if what ails you is the rampant sexlessness afflicting contemporary genre fiction. If there's a weakness, it may be that it's still a little bit difficult to say what The Forged is actually about. Aliens? Ancient gods? Cosmic conspiracies? Could be all the above, or none. I guess we're left to wait for issue 2 to find out more. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at the first issue of Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen from 1954, reprinted by DC 23 years ago as a Millennium Edition. To celebrate the turn of the century, the company released a broad line of reprints from across their history, and although they didn't contain the period advertisements we expect from today's facsimile editions, this issue does come with a brief introduction by historian Robert Greenberger, as well as credits sorely lacking from the company's current Golden Age facsimiles. The stories themselves are remarkable for being quite dry affairs compared to the more fantastical goings-on from later in the book's run. Superman is the only fantastic element in these three stories, all of which feature Cub reporter Jimmy Olsen saving the day against human-sized foes, gangsters, crooked loggers, and a team of disappointed construction workers. It's the last one that most foreshadows the cavalcade of absurdities soon to follow as the book takes off. Jimmy has to pretend to be Superman to prevent a construction crew from becoming impatient enough with honest work to go back to panhandling. It doesn't make more sense in context. The book showcases early work from Kurt Swan, who would go on to have a disproportionate impact on the look of the Man of Steel over the next 2 decades. Here, he's drawing the big guy, still a bit like Wayne Boring. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at the first issue of Laser Eraser and Press Button from 1985 in Eclipse Comics. Even if you've never heard of him, the character of Axel Press Button comes with quite a pedigree. Created by two Moores, Steve and Alan, no relation, the character first appeared in 1979 in backup strips for British rock magazine's Dark Star, before migrating to the epical Warrior magazine in 1982. The Warrior strips were compiled in the States by Eclipse in 1984, and followed by this series the next year, which the inside front cover assures us is brand new material never before seen and produced for the American market. The reason you want to keep an eye out for this book whenever you find it is the presence of the late, great Steve Dillon, artist for most of the duo's later strips. Although this may appear to be a relatively early work from Dillon, he had already been published for a decade by the time this book hit. As such, it's confident journeyman work, maybe a bit rough around the edges relative to where he'd be in another 5 or 10 years, but still very sharp. British sci-fi comics are a uniquely rowdy and garish field, and this is an excellent specimen thereof. The titular duo of spacefaring mercs kill a lot of people over the course of this comic, but Dillon's unshakable visual deadpan keeps the tone light. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at the 4th issue of the 3rd volume of Marvel's adaptation of The Destroyer. It's always struck me as odd that Remo Williams never had more of a foothold in comics. The character's larger-than-life men's adventure stories seem tailor-made for that kind of transplantation. And yet, to date, only one attempt has been made, by Marvel from 1989 to 1992. I think that was probably about a decade late to find the character's audience, truth be told. Williams feels like an artifact of the High Bronze Age, for better or for worse, questionable racial politics and all. In another era, Williams could easily have jostled elbows with Savage Sword of Conan and Guns and Ammo on the magazine racks of gas stations across the country. Alas, by 1989, Marvel's black and white magazine line was already on its last leg, so the attempt was made to switch to a color comic format by the next year. I picked this out of the dollar box because I thought it might have some early Lee Weeks. He drew much of the black and white run, but by 1992 it already moved on. This very issue would turn out to be the very last time Remo appeared in comics to date, 31 years ago. But it's hard to argue the character doesn't at least go out on a high note here, with an extra-large adventure drawn by none other than Dave Cockrum from a script by Will Murray and wrapped in a dinosaur cover by Walt Simonson. Will we ever see Remo Williams in comics again? Would we even want to in 2023? Beats the hell out of me. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at the first issue of DC's I, Vampire from 2011. This book was a part of DC's infamous New 52 initiative, which entailed the company canceling their entire line and rebooting everything from scratch. There were problems with that strategy in both conception and execution, but this series represents one of the handful of artistic successes that emerged from DC's willingness to try something new in the space opened by the clear-cutting. Artist Andrea Sorrentino wasn't even 2 years into his career when tapped here, one of the more visually ambitious books from that era of mainstream comics. The first run of I, Vampire was as the leading feature in the last years of House of Mystery. Created by James DeMatteis and Tom Sutton, the strip in all incarnations follows the adventures of vampire Andrew Bennett, a creature of the night cursed with a conscience, as well as being a sap and a sucker for the strong-willed women in his orbit. That core dynamic remains intact here. Bennett is committed to stopping Mary, Queen of Blood, from leading the vampires in a crusade against humanity, whereas Mary is committed above all to teasing Andrew for being a wet blanket. Writer Joshua Hale Fialkov's updated script can't but bring to mind just how ahead of the era the original series was, given the prevalence of vampire romance stories in the decades since that run. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at giant-sized Gwen Stacy #1 from Marvel Comics. This story took a circuitous route to release. Initially shipping in the first quarter of 2020, the Gwen Stacy miniseries was pushed to indefinite hiatus when the entire comics industry stopped in its tracks for the first months of COVID. That left the last issues of this book sitting in a drawer, so in 2022 they bundled the whole thing into a giant special. What sticks out to me is just how long it took them, after the runaway success of Spider-Gwen, to actually put out a new book with the original iteration of Peter Parker's first love. Now, if you remember Untold Tales of Spider-Man, the gimmick here is roughly the same. A new story set in the same time frame as the original Lee Ditko run, using the events of that series as landmarks around which to build a narrative. The story even tips its hat with a rare editorial note, pointing the reader in the direction of Bluesky and Olive's now classic flashback run. We see here a number of events that were never revealed in the original run. In the first place, the series begins by showing us why George Stacy walked with a cane, on its way to giving us the first meetings of Gwen and Norman Osborn, as well as an early appearance by the Kingpin. If you ever wondered how Wilson Fisk and Norman Osborn got along, the answer is provided here. There's even a first and only meeting between Gwen and the Uncanny X-Men, including an on-panel meeting with Jean Grey, which seems like the kind of thing that could have probably been milked for more than a few panels. Writer Christos Gage understands his source material well, playing into the drama with a closer look at the machinations of early Spider foes Big Man and Crime Master. The real standout, however, is the work of fellow 90s throwback Todd Nauck, still experience a prolonged and welcoming second wind to his storied career. This is a very good-looking comic book, and anyone wondering as to whether or not we needed yet another Untold Tales series after so many returns to that well can simply look to Nauck's art for confirmation that if Todd Nauck wants to draw Gwen Stacy, Todd Nauck should get to draw as much Gwen Stacy as he wants. I'd be up for a sequel. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at OMAC #1 from DC Comics and the great Jack Kirby. Now, I'm not going to say that you couldn't give 70s Kirby away when I was a kid, but you could still find the Eternals clogging quarter boxes as late as the mid-90s. 70s Kirby was available and cheap. It didn't have the best reputation in this period. Conventional wisdom for years, even after his death, held the 70s material as distinctly lesser than. Strange books crafted according to the whims of an increasingly eccentric creator whose tastes had diverged significantly from the mainstream he had once defined. Now, of course, it's become axiomatic that 70s Kirby was ahead of his time in a lot of ways. Case in point, our specimen for today, the first issue of OMAC from 1974. By the time this issue shipped, the bloom was off the rose of the King's relationship with DC. Famously, the cancellation of the Fourth World titles took a great deal of wind out of his sails. Accordingly, OMAC is always read to me as an angry book. Ostensibly, according to the text piece in the back of the book, this is a series about future shock, the existential dislocation that accompanies massive paradigm shifts in technology. In practice, though, he's also mad about money. The dystopia here is a place where anything can be bought, be it artificial people or entire cities. The disposable plastic people whose factory is destroyed in this issue are risible enough even before we see that the pseudo-people are being deployed as explosive assassins. As an everyman, Buddy Blank serves as exemplar of the values of the world that's coming. A physically unimpressive specimen, constantly bullied and belittled, crushed by economic forces beyond his comprehension. Blank is a perfect vehicle for the Global Peace Agency to strike back at the criminal overreach of technology. It's not revenge, however, that motivates OMAC, but righteous wrath aimed directly at those forces of unrestrained progress, pushing at every step to minimize and monetize every aspect of human life. An angry book, yes, but still disconcertingly timely, almost 50 years on. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Punisher War Journal #8 from 1989. This comic marks two milestones for me, the first issue of the Punisher I ever bought, as well as my first exposure to the art of Mr. Jim Lee. It was such a successful introduction to the character that I didn't buy him again until I saw Dr. Doom on a cover. At the time, I preferred books that had more fantasy to them and avoided the more street-level stuff. Frankly, I still do, even though I eventually came around to Frank here. At 35 years removed, I'd say that cover must have caught my eye. It was later used in some licensing, if memory serves me well. It's a rare team-up between Jim Lee and Klaus Janson. They only worked on a few issues of this series, but they look good together. The interior is inked by Lee himself, and pleasantly grimy in a way that may surprise anyone only familiar with Lee's work after the advent of Scott Williams' clean and legible line. Lee's inking is phenomenal, full of chunky lines and unexpected decisions. There's some screen tone here, for one, and spatter. He's playing around with different tools right on the page, and the results are endlessly inventive. Left to his own devices, these pages are compelling and unique. As for the story itself, well, I'll be honest, the early run of War Journal reads odd. The character already had a spin-off book, but they seemed stuck in terms of not quite having a solid feel for his solo adventures. Plot-wise, this is a mixture of reactionary paranoia about 80s street crime and ninja interludes starring the Shadow Masters, a truly obscure group that hasn't appeared anywhere in 30 years. It stands out in hindsight as not that different in a lot of ways from what DC was doing at the time with Green Arrow. Worth noting, the main villain here is solely dispatched by the Punisher's super high-tech van, which struck me then and now as anticlimactic. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Vigilante 14 from 1984 in DC Comics. This book makes an interesting contrast with yesterday's selection, both books devoted to protagonists committed to extrajudicial killings as a way of life, but not necessarily created equally. This iteration of the Vigilante character is Adrian Chase, crusading district attorney by day and ruthless killer by night. He represents a walking contradiction not embodied by the Punisher, who exists fully outside the law after all, and so neatly dodges most accusations of hypocrisy. Chase, on the other hand, is an officer of the court and aspiring judge. This conflict of interest is one of which the character himself is fully aware, thanks to writer Marv Wolfman, even as he often frames himself as helpless to resist the compulsion to put on a mask and murder people beyond the reach of the legal system. Now, the reason we're here today is that this book was drawn by spectacular guest artist Trevor Von Eden. What's more, Von Eden appears to be having a bit of fun. This story is called Shadows, and the art throughout is defined by the use of strong spotted blacks on every page. The villain here has built a special suit to allow them to blend in with the shadows, and Von Eden takes the opportunity to put as much black on the page as possible, often revealing action only through silhouette. This is a masterclass in minimalism. With so much darkness on the page, storytelling is all about composition, using limited light sources to direct the eye down the page like a cattle chute. He's abetted here by the work of Tatiana Wood, already a standout. Her use of flat greens and blues on brighter paper takes full advantage of contemporaneous printing advances in a way that was, in hindsight, years ahead of the rest of the industry. There's little mistaking a Wood page for any other colorist of the era, especially when paired with frequent collaborator Von Eden. Howdy folks, today we're looking at 1973's Love and Romance number 14 from Charlton Comics. It's got 3 stories, and of these, all 3 are puzzling to a greater or lesser degree, if not outright objectionable, from 2023. The first, Someday, is about a girl who grows up from 10 years old wanting to marry a friend of the family, at least 11 or 12 years older. And it's not the age gap, but the fact that they met when she was so young, and it's presented as just a matter of waiting for her to grow up enough to seduce him at a costume party. The second, Beware of Latin Lovers, doesn't even have a Latin lover. It has a man pretending to be French, adopting a fake accent in Paris for the purpose of gaslighting a woman into believing him a French lover. Her friends know all about the deception, and when she finds out, she's not even upset the guy has been lying to her for a day and a night. And the third story is just sad, featuring a woman who pretends to be in love with an old boyfriend recovering from malaria, lying about the fact that she was engaged to someone else. All these stories hinge on lying. There are no credited writers, and frankly, I probably wouldn't want my name on this either. The artists do their best, but the fact is, Charlton had quality control issues throughout their history, and this series is a great example of that principle in action. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos number 75 from Marvel Comics in the tail end of 1969. Sergeant Fury is one of the more underread runs from the heyday of Marvel's Silver Age, but during its time it earned a reputation as the book for Dad's slightly exaggerated war stories, as contrasted with DC's slightly more grounded Sergeant Rock character. That wasn't always the case, however, as the later run of the book would occasionally veer into a more somber tone. Case in point, this issue here, written by Gary Friedrich and titled The Deserter. This is a downbeat story about just that. The Howlers get a new member, Private Wilson, fresh out of basic training. Now, you might question whether or not a kid fresh out of basic would be assigned to a squad like the Howlers without any previous combat experience. Probably not, especially given the sensitive nature of his first mission, behind enemy lines to save a kidnapped general crucial to the D-Day operation. But that's the story. The Howlers are parachuted into Fortress Europe to accomplish the impossible, except after a strong start, the new kid happens to catch a bad case of shell shock. Now, of course, we know now about PTSD and what standing next to an explosion actually does to a person, but it doesn't really matter here. Wilson runs away when his unit needs him, so there's no happy ending. The kid runs and the kid gets a court-martial. The issue ends with a firing squad. Not a happy story, but a real story. Maybe a little bit more real than most Sergeant Fury stories. The art here is by Dick Ayers, an unsung hero of the 60s bullpen who I've come to admire more as I appreciate the work he did later in the period, after his stint as one of Kirby's definitive inkers. He's inked here by the legendary John Severin, who, it must be said, makes every inked page look a little like a John Severin page. But Ayers leans into his anchor's strengths, and the result is a sharp-looking comic book. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at the Batman Chronicles number 11 from 1998 in DC Comics. Batman Chronicles was a quarterly anthology that often boasted interesting creators working on stories that at least initially didn't necessarily have to fit into monthly continuity. That enabled it to attract a wide gamut of creators who wouldn't have any interest in popping into one of the main titles. This issue exemplifies the tendency with a special Elseworlds focus, featuring 3 very different stories of Batman as he never existed in mainstream continuity. The first story is a true milestone, Paul Pope's debut work on the character. Here he gives us a Batman from an entirely different 1938. Baruch Wayne, a Jewish artist who takes to the skies of Berlin as a crime-fighting saboteur in the last days before the war. This Batman is inordinately fond of Ludwig von Mises and explicitly libertarian in ideology, certainly a very striking and distinctive view of the character, although perhaps one best quarantined to a single adventure. Pope later returned for the well-regarded Batman Year 100 series, but the standout here is Ted McKeever's indelible color. He's not afraid to bathe an entire page in blood red. You might think Paul Pope Batman would be enough for most comics, but this issue keeps going. There's another appearance of the pirate Batman, Leatherwing, originally created by Chuck Dixon and Enrique Alcatena for Detective Comics Annual number 7 in 1994. I admit, I liked Pirate Batman. They even did a toy for the Pirate Batman. And if you're not completely sold on Dixon working in verse, the narration takes the form of a pirate shanty. There's no flies whatsoever on Alcatena's glorious full-page illustrations of Batman in the golden age of piracy. I would read just about anything Alcatena drew. Last but not least, John Francis Moore scripts a noirish tale of Bruce Wayne as a PI on the trail of the Catwoman, who, in this story, is a weird Catwoman, cursed by a fortune-teller to stalk the night as a feline monster. I'm always on board for Kieran Dwyer, and his work here is truly exceptional. He's using a thick, chunky brush line that practically drenches the page in black ink. Now, I'd be lying if I said every issue of Batman Chronicles was as strong as Pope, Alcatena, and Dwyer. That's a killer lineup by any measure. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Conan Saga number 25 from 1989 in Marvel Comics. Conan Saga was a companion magazine to the company's long-running Savage Sword of Conan, reprinting stories from the first decade of the character's tenure at Marvel. The early run of Saga is notable for presenting the Barry Windsor Smith run in glorious black and white, for instance, highly recommended if you can find them. Later on, the book was largely devoted to representing material from the early run of Savage Sword, as this magazine presents the final chapter of a serial from 1975, an extended adaptation of Robert E. Howard's original Conan novel, Hour of the Dragon. As you might expect from the pairing of Roy Thomas and John Buscema, the story is dense and a bit talky, perhaps to be expected when dealing with a prose adaptation from a writer who was paid by the word. It presents the climax of Conan's battle with the ancient sorcerer Zaltotin, resurrected by the Nemedeans for the purpose of deposing Conan as king of Aquilonia. The story here begins with Conan back at the head of his army and marching stolidly to meet his gruesome foe. The inks here, in glorious black and white with the spotted grays native to Marvel's black and white format, are credited to a group known as The Tribe, credited with a number of Marvel books from the middle of the 70s. The group was composed of familiar names such as Alfredo Alcala, Ken Landgraf, Rudy Nebres, and Tony DeZuniga, just to name a few. However, the book's appeal doesn't end there. The issue is also a bit of a Howard Chaykin spotlight. In addition to the cover, we have a Thomas-scripted Solomon Kane yarn reprinted from 77. It's a ghost story about skeletons chained in the attic, a short subject with a nasty twist ending, almost redolent of VC. This is followed by a short pinup portfolio by Chaykin presented as The Chaykin Barbarians, originally from later in the same year. 77 was a good year for Chaykin. He'd been bubbling around the Marvel offices for a while before his work for the original comic adaptation of Star Wars became perhaps the most reprinted story of the decade. The last story is a Red Sonja 12-pager, again written by Thomas along with Claire Noto, and drawn by the inimitable Frank Thorne. It's 12 pages of Thorne drawing Red Sonja in glorious black and white, so you know it's worth the price of admission all by itself. The last stretch of the book is filled with pinups, which are maddeningly not credited, thankfully. Most of the artists sign their pieces, so we see familiar Conan talent like Mike Dougherty and Gary Quapish alongside Dave Simons and Mark Pasella. The very last page of the book belongs to Tony Salmons, occasional Conan artist throughout the period when he was supposedly blackballed from much of the rest of the company at Shooter's behest. test. It doesn't look like anything else in the entire book, but boy, does it look good. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Marvel's Clobberin' Time #1, a new series featuring the work of the great Steve Skroce, drawing and writing. I think I bought just about everything Skroce drew for the company in the 90s, a pile of books that included runs on Cable, X-Man, and Amazing Spider-Man, all before he decamped to Hollywood and started working in storyboards. You may have heard of a little movie called The Matrix. Well, he did that, and subsequently contributed to just about everything else the Wachowskis have done since. It's a special day whenever he deigns to darken our doorstep with new work, such as this limited series here, more or less Marvel 2-in-1, but all but name. Our boy Ben Grimm teams up here with the Incredible Hulk. Due to the machinations of some kind of Iron Man Dr. Doom mashup from the future, Ben and Bruce Banner wind up in another dimension fighting monsters. The Thing is such a perfect team-up character because he's a great conversationalist. He knows how to talk to people, and makes an excellent foil for the rather less talkative Hulk. This is a dynamite-looking book, but you knew going in that it would be. It didn't have to be funny as well, but it is. Skroce draws a great Hulk and an even better Thing. This is the nicest-looking book Marvel will put out this month, and possibly even this year. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Mystery in Space number 113 from 1980 in DC Comics. At the dawn of the 80s, DC resurrected the numbering for one of their most storied sci-fi books, Mystery in Space. Sadly, the reboot didn't last a full year. It's been a truism since the days of EC that sci-fi just doesn't sell as well as horror or fantasy, leastwise in terms of anthologies. However, that brief run was absolutely stacked, star-studded from beginning to end. For starters, there's a Joe Kubert cover here, with a scene from the Joe Kubert story inside the book. True, it's only 3 pages, written by Len Wein, with a last panel twist you may very well see coming, but it's still 3 pages of Joe Kubert drawing a space story colored by Tetjana Wood. The lead-off feature for the magazine features none other than Michael Golden on pencils, inked by Bob Wyacek, and working from a script by George Cashton. It's an effectively creepy tale about better living through computing. Now, this isn't quite the hyper-detailed work that Golden was already capable of producing by this time, but even his looser pencils here read phenomenally well. The highlight, even next to Golden, Kubert, and another fellow we'll mention in a moment, is probably the Jerry Grandinetti 8-pager, written by J.M. DeMatteis. It's pretty intense for an 8-pager in the middle of the book, dense enough and mean enough you could have almost mistaken it for Tharg. Grandinetti's inking himself, and the results are just gorgeous. Heavy brushwork and claustrophobic panels make for a dense read that ends on a legitimately eerie note. And, of course, last in the book, but certainly not least, Mr. Trevor Von Eden. Still young, still not quite the master he would become, but still quite interesting for all that. This is another cast-in script with a twist ending, not perhaps the most challenging material, but even in the space of these 5 pages, Von Eden can be recognized for his scrupulous storytelling. Follow the sight lines. Even as far back as this, there was no mistaking him for just about anyone else. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Marvel's What If, Volume 2, number 97 from 1997. The later part of the 90s run of What If moved away from the series' traditional and still familiar tropes, which usually involve the Watcher answering a direct question and running down the answer. Stories in this period could hinge on more ambiguous or general hooks, such as this issue, written by James Felder and devoted to a tale of an alternate Black Knight struggling against Dr. Doom in the ruins of an alternate Camelot. The Black Knight is a unique character at Marvel, given his status as an artifact of the company's pre-Hero 50s output, as well as the most prominent co-creation of Joe Maneely, formed of artist who died right before the company reinvented itself in the 60s. Given that, and the fact that King Arthur and Camelot have been a part of the Marvel Universe proper going all the way back to the early 60s, the milieu really hasn't been that prominent, save for a handful of Iron Man stories with the aforementioned Doom. Somehow, although we're not told how, Doom became stranded in the past here. Iron Man isn't mentioned at all, and his main rival in this time is the similarly displaced Nathaniel Richards. Now, the real reason you want this comic is because it's drawn by a man named Leonardo Manco, one of the great unsung stylists of this period. He left a trail of fill-ins, anthology pieces, and short runs of staggering quality at the company, all before the turn of the century. He's abetted here by the somber colors of Marie Javins, current editor-in-chief at DC, incidentally, and the result is wild and unique, meticulously detailed, and endlessly expressive. You owe it to yourself to grab any Manco you come across.